to the Nonprofit Lab, a podcast dedicated to the ongoing discovery of how we can all be a bigger part of social change through the lens of the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Puya Porak. I'm an industrial engineer, nonprofit enthusiast, and CEO of MatchNice, a social impact tech startup with a mission to connect the nonprofit ecosystem and maximize social impact. Join us on our startup journey as we look to uncover and shake up the status quo in the world of nonprofits. On today's episode, I have two guests, Anna Barber and Rashida Peterson. Both are incredible career fundraisers who between them have served and helped nonprofits of all sizes create holistic fundraising strategies and raise millions of dollars in funding to achieve their missions. In this episode, we talk candidly about what it means to be a nonprofit fundraiser, the role and skills of a development officer. We evaluate the funding landscape for nonprofits and discuss the fundraising skills gap and how Rashida and Anna are working together to upskill fundraising in the sector. A little more about my guests today. Anna Barber is a 20-year fundraising veteran who specializes in individual major gift training and campaign planning. She's the founder and principal strategist at Barber and Associates, a boutique fundraising consulting firm. Barber and Associates continues to work with a myriad of clients structuring campaigns ranging from $500,000 to $80 million, conducting fundraising trainings and advising on leadership-level individual giving strategies. The firm has primarily worked with institutions of higher education, museums, social justice organizations, and healthcare entities. Prior to starting the firm, Anna was the first Central Major Gifts Officer at the Smithsonian Institution, a member of the National Museum of African American History and Cultures, fundraising team that surpassed its private philanthropic goal of $350 million. In 2017, her work there was featured in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, where she secured $42 million in leadership and major gift support, highlighted by the closure of 22 individual $1 million gifts, 90% of which were contributed by first-time donors to the Smithsonian. Leading into its grand opening in 2016, Anna led the effort to host a $1 million per plate fundraiser at the home of Pauletta and Denzel Washington, and a mid-level fundraising event that generated $5 million from $25,000 donors. Prior to the Smithsonian, Barber spent 10 years working as a frontline fundraiser in intercollegiate college and athletics. She served as the director of major gifts for Michigan State University Athletics, the assistant director of development at Miami University in Ohio, and a management associate at Arizona State University. Barber earned a Juris Doctorate in intellectual property from Arizona State University and a Bachelor of Science in political science from Howard University. Rashida Peterson is the CEO and founder of 1847 Philanthropic. The catalyst to establish 1847 Philanthropic emanates from Miss Peterson's strong desire to create a lasting impact in Africa by bringing the essentials of fundraising to their nonprofit institutions. Rashida's career has been built on expertise gained from leading major fundraising and development initiatives in Africa, as well as expanding U.S. trade and investments in developing countries. Working within the development departments of international nonprofits, she has been responsible for annual funding goals of over $16 million in institutional funding and over $1.3 million in cumulative unrestricted sponsorship dollars. Her steadfast focus on causes with a strong community involvement and local impact enabled her to work with some of the major civil rights leaders of our time, including Ambassador Andrew Young at Good Works International and an international management consulting firm, and she served as the vice president for programs and business development at OIC International, which is an organization that carries the legacy of the late Reverend Leon H. Sullivan. Rashida began her career at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where she served as the East Africa Desk Officer with the International Trade Administration. Additionally, she served as the acting senior commercial officer with the African Development Bank in Tunis, Tunisia. She was formerly the director of membership and marketing for the Corporate Council on Africa, a trade organization devoted to increasing U.S. trade and investment in Africa. Rashida is a noted speaker on topics related to international development, organizational development, and local impact, fundraising, of course, as well as the importance of diversity in international affairs at conferences and events around the world, including the Council on Foreign Relations Conference on Diversity in International Affairs, South by Southwest Skull World Forum, South by Southwest Skull World Forum, and Africa 2018 Forum, amongst others. Ms. Peterson holds an international business degree from the University of Maryland. She currently serves on the advisory board of the University of Maryland's Hinman CEOs program, is a member of Bridge Institute's Africa Policy Group, an active member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and a mentor for College Bound in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Nonprofit Lab, Rashida and Anna. How are you both doing?
Great.
Thank you. Yes, great.
Well, this is the first time we've had two guests on at the same time, so it'll be interesting juggling the questions between you both, but there's a reason you two are together. And let's actually start with your stories of how you got into the nonprofit sector, your individual journeys, and then I want to navigate to how you found yourselves working together. But Rashida, would you mind telling us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I really love your background. I actually have a trade background. I started my career at the Department of Commerce. I was the East Africa desk officer and sort of fell into the nonprofit space, which I think is actually quite common, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area. It tends to be like you either, after government service, will go into nonprofit, or you go into lobbying. And so I spent a lot of time after my government service looking at what I wanted to do, and ended up going into a trade association, a nonprofit trade association that also had a C4 arm. And I was supporting, it was my first time supporting fundraising. And I was in charge of corporate sponsorships. And so really that was my first understanding of like, wait, we don't have OMB that actually gives us a budget each year and we have to spend it, like we have to raise money. So that opened my eyes to this entire nonprofit world and really how I got started.
So my journey was a bit different. I actually started in college athletics. So I was in law school. I wanted to be an athletic director. I decided that, college athletics was kind of the way to go. And when I graduated from law school, the athletic director at Arizona State hired me as a management associate. And his wife was the associate vice president for development. And of course, as the athletic director, a large portion of your responsibilities are to raise funds. And so I really learned quite a bit from both Gene and Sheila Smith, who were at Arizona State. And he encouraged me to go into development as the fastest way to becoming an athletic director. And so my foray into development was through college athletics, and I spent 10 years, in a development capacity, mostly working in major gifts. So working with individual donors that had the capacity to give, $50,000 or more over 5 years. After leaving Arizona State, I went to Miami of Ohio. I went to Michigan State, all in a major gift capacity, and served in multiple different roles. At one institution, I oversaw athletics communications from the development perspective. At another institution, I oversaw the scholarship endowment. So there were different facets of development in addition to raising money that I was responsible for. And then after 10 years in college athletics, transitioned into the Smithsonian. I was the first central major gift officer at the Smithsonian, which was basically raising gifts from individual donors again at the $100,000 level. And we represented all 19 museums and 9 research centers. So that was kind of the foray into it, and the career trajectory as well.
Wow, Anna, thank you. I think I said Anna in the beginning. My apologies for that.
Oh no, you're fine. You're fine.
And Rashida, you said OMB. For our folks that aren't from the White House, that's the
Office of the Budget. Yeah.
Yes,
Management and Budget.
Management and Budget. That's amazing that you both kind of fell into and found your way into the nonprofit sector. What's made you stick around? Like, why? You could be doing so many other things. Why decide to focus on just like supporting nonprofits? I know Anna, you kind of navigated the university space, and Rashida, you had many kind of opportunities ahead of you. Why nonprofits?
Well, I mean, for me, the initial interest in staying with nonprofits was the fact that I wanted to be an athletic director. And in order to be an athletic director, you have to work at a university, which is primarily, they're all nonprofits for the most part. I mean, not all, but a majority are nonprofit institutions. And then, I realized that I really had a skill set and had the ability to be able to effectively raise money from individual donors, which not many people have, kind of an innate ability to be able to do. And so it was something that I wanted to refine and really become one of the best in the profession. And so, after 10 years in college athletics, I decided, this skill set was better served at an organization that I felt really was giving back to the country. And so that was one of the initial motivations for going to the Smithsonian, which is also a nonprofit. And these are huge nonprofits, so I think sometimes people think of nonprofit as being like small startup organizations and don't realize the magnitude of some of the organizations that are considered nonprofits. And then transitioning into a consulting role where now where I own my own fundraising consulting firm, it really is a love of helping organizations that are truly helping society.
I agree with that. I think that you really have to be passionate about the mission and be sort of at your core, have values that are mission driven, because for sure the development space is hectic and challenging. And as you said, the skill set to really become like a top fundraiser, I would consider Anna a top fundraiser, consider myself also a top fundraiser, just by, amount of millions raised. I come from a little bit of the smaller, scrappier nonprofit. I have tended to look for nonprofits that are aligned with my values. And that was sort of, the idea of changing the world and like really being able to do that every day and being very passionate about that work was something that I have been constantly excited about with nonprofits, because I think that like when we, talk to clients, I also have a consulting firm that I've had for the last 8 years. When we talk to clients, I just get super excited about their missions and their visions. And I'm like, yes, there are people out here that are doing this work. And so I think that is what has kept me in the space. But like Anna, when I realized that there was a thing called like fundraising and kind of being falling into it from the corporate sponsorships perspective, and then being like, oh, this is a whole industry, like I totally get it. I realized that I was also really, that I lead with like relationship building, and that just is like my personality. And so I was like, ooh, this really, this type of position actually allows me to do something that is natural to me and that I really like doing. And so I continue to develop my skills over time and have put a lot of, my own personal like goals and trying to like, improve writing skills and taking courses and just over time, learning from other professionals in the space and really investing in myself to be able to get to the point of like a very, very senior level fundraiser that can now support organizations in multi different facets, because I've been with so many different organizations over the last 18 years.
I love that. And part of why I was so excited to have you both on the show is you both bring such diverse but shared deep experience when it comes to fundraising for nonprofit organizations of all sizes, all missions. And it doesn't surprise me that passion theme is universal. It seems to be universal, obviously, for everyone working in the sector. So this is getting into the joining of you two, the forces of your skills. How did you both find yourselves working together, and what are you working on now?
So in the development profession in general, there are not very many African Americans or diverse development professionals. So we were generally one of the only, if one of a few, African American or Hispanic or Asian, generally the only one, in our respective, organizations. And so when we went out on our own and started our own consulting firms, fundraising consulting firms, I actually saw an email come out, or actually I responded to an email through the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and Rashida responded, and I looked her up and I was like, oh my gosh, another Black, fundraising consultant. This is absolutely amazing to have been, an effective, successful fundraiser, to step out on your own, to start your own firm, to be able to persist, as an owner of a fundraising consulting firm is pretty significant. And so when we initially met, we connected immediately and realized that we were very aligned in our values and aligned in the work that we wanted to do. And so we decided at that time, even before we had a formal partnership, that we wanted to partner in some way, shape, or form. And that has since evolved into a formal company called Ask a Fundraiser. And I'll let Rashida jump in on what Ask a Fundraiser is. But it's been a great partnership thus far.
Yes, it really has. And it the first time we actually met, it was like fireworks. I mean, I know a lot of people say that like owning a business, I mean, as you know, is like a marriage, right? It's like there's a commitment, there's trust, there's values alignment. And the first time we actually like were in the same room, we're like, like, hello. It really was special. So I'm really excited that we've continued to work together. We have worked together separately on a few contracts, and we sort of tested out the model that is now backing into Ask a Fundraiser. And so Ask a Fundraiser is a e-learning tool. I like to call it the Rosetta Stone of fundraising, because we consider fundraising a language, and it's a love language for us, but it is a language. And with languages, there's structure, there's grammar, there's a way to approach it, there's all of those things. There's practice that's required to actually become proficient in the language. And so that's why we kind of use that metaphor. And we have been working over the last really 2 years to refine this curriculum that is going into the Ask a Fundraiser tool. And we're just, really excited about being able to bring that to market. So we're working on that right now together.
Yeah, and I would also add that, the fundraising profession has best practices. And there is an art and a science kind of those best practices. There's a process by which organizations should go through to develop the infrastructure to be able to fundraise most effectively. And because the fundraising profession is such a catch-all profession, where there's not necessarily many degree programs that people can go through to pursue this line of work, there a lot of times we find that people are completely unsure of the process that they need to go through to have an effective fundraising program. And so we really have worked very hard on putting the fundamentals of building infrastructure to be a successful development office or a successful fundraising into this program, e-learning tool, so that people understand what the process looks like for building out a successful program. And both of us, recognize and understand that each of the tools that we're helping users build out in the Ask a Fundraiser program are tools that we need as fundraisers to be effective in raising dollars for an organization. And so that was kind of the premise behind how we put the program together and the types of knowledge that we're sharing with organizations about how to do this. Kind of at a foundational level.
That's so fascinating and opens the door to so many other questions around the topic of fundraising. But just to acknowledge the fireworks between you guys, I love that, because you're already like doing my job as hosting and passing the mic between each other, which is very, very nice. So thank you for that. And Anna, I really appreciated the way that you described the skill of fundraising as a language. And you also said earlier in the interview, some of these skills are innate, but then there are learned skills as well. And it's just like love languages as well. Just curious, before we go into some of those core skills, what's your overall perspective on the role of the development officer, the individual who is in charge of fundraising? From what I've learned in the nonprofit sector, it seems like a very fixed and demanded and highly needed position for especially large nonprofits, but really for every nonprofit. Large nonprofits seem to have those position openings, and there is an office for that individual. But when it comes to smaller, scrappier nonprofits, it's more like a shared responsibility among the board and the executive director and the founder, et cetera. So just curious to hear your thoughts on, first, the role of the executive, the development officer, and then, what you see in terms of the differences of that role between larger nonprofits and smaller nonprofits.
So my perspective on the role of a development professional takes multiple different facets. And I think that it's broken down into two different categories internally, but the development professional or development officer is always externally facing. So is working with external constituents, prospects, donors. And then the two different categories that it's broken down into are individuals and institutions. And within the individual kind of portfolio, you have, annual fund donors, which are generally smaller level donors that are engaged through direct mail, online giving, kind of like low touch engagement opportunities. And then you move into major gifts, which is, generally larger gifts that are payable over a period of years and are designated to a specific project or initiative. And then you move into planned giving, which is estate gifts. So there are different roles and responsibilities for each of the development officers within the individual giving portfolio. And then on the other side, on the institutional side of things, they can be broken down into corporate development professionals. And Rashida talked a little bit about her experience working in corporate sponsorship. So there can be corporate philanthropic giving and there can be corporate sponsorships, which are, come from corporations, but are different and come from different budgets. And then there's also development offices that work specifically with foundations. And there is a different process by which you apply for foundation gifts that is very different than, individual donors for sure. So I don't know, Rashida, did that feel comprehensive or?
Yeah, the one thing, we are in Washington, D.C. So there is this other massive sort of industry that is the USAID, the sort of government business development, which also looks very different. And that normally tends, I mean, it has shifted over a number of years. It's most closely aligned to institutional, but I would say with, when you're going after like large contracts with the US government or with multilateral institutions like World Bank or the African Development Bank or DFID or they changed their name, but the UK aid folks or the Germans, like your structure of how you have to go after those particular types of funding is much different. Like normally you have a team of people that come together and those roles are somewhat different, but I would say they're most closely we're looking at it aligned with like a large institution like a Ford Foundation or a Kellogg Foundation that has like, multiple pages of of narrative and just requirements for organizations. So that's a hard lift as like an individual, but we can talk a little bit more about that too, in terms of like teams, development teams.
Just off the bat, that's like so much more than I understood about the role of a development officer, right? Like in my mind, it's like the person who's responsible for getting cash into the door for the nonprofit. And in essence, it is, but there's so many different segments of revenue that could come in and donations that could come in. How do you describe the importance of diversification when it comes to fundraising sources? What I've seen in some of my research is a lot of nonprofits are potentially over reliant on grants or over reliant on a handful of like big donors. And the potential conflict of interest then is like if you are just dependent on that grants come with requirements, and you might be potentially putting a box around your mission and the work that you can actually achieve versus the vision that you have as an organization, similar with big donors. So how do you approach the analysis and the guidance for nonprofits around diversification when it comes to fundraising?
Yeah, I think that's why we've really spent so much time with developing this Ask a Fundraiser platform, because I think the immediate thought is like, okay, let's diversify. But in fact, like there's like many steps to take before you even get to that conversation. Like if we're all friends here, so we're going to tell you the real. It's not like, oh, okay, you have a small organization and you have like some core grants and they're major, let's say they're major gifts and it's mostly individuals. And then you're like, oh, well, let's like start working on institutions because we need to diversify. Actually, probably what you need to do is you need to take a look at your goals. You need to do a goal setting activity. You need to really understand what I like to call kind of like the marketplace. Like, so who is your current donor? What do they fund? Like, why are they funding you? You need to do that reflection first before you start looking at like bringing in additional things. Because what happens is you'll say, okay, we have these like, let's say your board, normally it comes down from the board of like, you're over reliant and this is kind of a governance issue. So let's take a look at like different revenue streams. And then the nonprofit will react to that and be like, okay, there's money out here, there's institutional, what about Ford? What about Gates? And like, no. Because you'll spend a lot of time going down that route and you haven't done the work that needs to be done to make sure that you are even aligned with that potential donor, right? Do you have the capacity internally to go down a 6-month process with an institutional donor? Or does it make more sense to take a look at another strategy, right? So I think that like before you take that leap, and I know that sometimes when you're in the heat of it, and you're getting sort of requests or pressure down from your board, your instinct is to be like, okay, let's figure out like where there's other money. But in fact, what we have found with working with a lot of our clients, and we've tested this, as you know, with a number of different organizations throughout the country. And what we found is like, you really do have to do that foundational work first in order to set yourself up to be able to attract the funding that is from a diverse stakeholder, you know. Anna, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is pretty accurate and comprehensive. I mean, the other thing is, you know, after doing all the foundational work around goals and, you know, setting budgets and having a comprehensive campaign and understanding, you know, kind of where you're going and having a stewardship structure in place, it really does require time to build a new audience. So if most of your donors are institutional donors, corporate or foundation, and you want to transition some of your portfolio into individual donors, it's not going to happen overnight. The cultivation cycle for individual donors is, for major gift donors, is generally about 18 months. And so there's a significant investment of time that is going to be required to cultivate those relationships to the point where they would be comfortable in investing $50,000 or $100,000 in your organization. And so I think a lot of organizations lose sight of the runway that it requires to be able to diversify their portfolios. And then this is kind of an unrelated response, but this is something that, you know, we have begun advising organizations on very intentionally, is when they're thinking about their goals and thinking about what their fundraising priorities are going to be, you know, the direction they want to go in as organizations, we want them to think about at least one project or initiative that will become an earned revenue stream for that nonprofit. So that when you're asking for philanthropic dollars, you can ask for a project that would ultimately provide sustainable revenue for the organization long-term. So you're not so dependent on, you know, philanthropic revenue for all of your operations. We want to make sure that there are other earned revenue streams that are built in.
Yeah, I love that. And that's actually been a theme that's come up in a few of the episodes that we've had so far around the importance of generating revenue as a nonprofit, as a sustainable path. So to suss out some of the differences then when it comes to your wealth of experience in consulting for and guiding very large nonprofits and smaller nonprofits, what are some of the things that you're seeing as like, whoa, we got to address this, or hey, have you thought about that, that are most common for large nonprofits and for small nonprofits? And then maybe we can wrap it up with something that's shared between.
I think for a lot of smaller nonprofits, this question of runway is a really, really important one. And being just overworked and lacking capacity. And so I think that what we try to do is, you know, be honest about sort of the project cycle in terms of like what it's going to take to kind of close, particularly if they're looking to if they're looking to bring on new sources of funding. As Anna said, like when you actually have an experienced fundraiser that is like, you know, a consultant that will give you the like, so just so you know, this is going to be an 18-month thing. That's when you know you have a good one, because a lot of times the thought is like, okay, we're going to, you know, push out this campaign and like, we're going to start to receive, you know, funds in the door for this fiscal year. We get a lot of that, like a lot of like a lack of understanding of just how long it takes to actually convert. And we try to be like super, super honest with our, particularly, I think it's more of just the stress, you know, with the lack of capacity and also like the demands on sometimes a very small team. And so they want to do like so many things at once, when in fact, sometimes the best thing is to anchor yourself and to try to do what you do really well and sell that, and not chase funding. So I would say that that's probably what I see the most in terms of on the smaller nonprofit side. And I also work with the international nonprofits too. So, from anywhere from Brazil to sub-Saharan Africa. So that happens a lot, just like kind of a lack of understanding of like the timeline, and also what it's going to take to attract and align with different types of funding.
Yeah. And from, and I think, part of the challenge, both for large nonprofits and small nonprofits, one of the recurring challenges that I see is that organizations don't fully plan what their fundraising strategy is going to be. They don't really think about like what their aspirational goals are. Like, 20 years down the road, where do they see the organization? What kind of impact do they want to see in the world? And how are they best situated to bring about the change that they want to see happen, from an aspirational perspective? And then what types of goals and needs do they need to actually develop and articulate to be able to reach that aspirational vision down the road? So what are their plans for the next 3 years? What are their plans for the next 5 years? How much money do they actually need for their annual operating budget? A lot of organizations can't answer the question of what their annual operating budget is. If you can't answer the question of what your annual operating budget is, how are you raising money? And then beyond your annual operating budget, what are the specific priorities and initiatives that you need funding for? And have you thought through what those priorities are and why you need that money and what kind of impact it'll have on your organization and on society in moving you towards that aspirational vision? And so that's part of the foundational work that Rashida and I really work with organizations on, really setting up what their fundraising goals are and being able to articulate them in a way that resonates with funders and encourages funders that these are the organizations that have the solutions to the world's problems. And so we see that from large organizations and small organizations. Fortunately, I came from college athletics, and there is a reason why college athletics is so successful. It's not just because it's sports and everybody loves sports. It's because they are very, very clear and intentional about what their goals are, why they need investments in those specific goals, how much those goals are, and have case statements, fully designed, published case statements that can be used as collateral in soliciting, funding. And so there's no ambiguity in what college athletics is raising money. Like almost any program across the country, there's no ambiguity. But many other nonprofits struggle with articulating what those specifics are.
I've seen so much of that, and actually that theme of just potentially a lack of clarity and transparency when it comes to fundraising is at the core of what Match Nice is looking to provide a tool around for online fundraising, right? We're helping nonprofits to say, exactly what are you working on? What is the potential impact? How much do you need for this initiative? And let's be transparent and clear with the donors. And this is a challenge that we're also looking to aim, and I'm looking to take aim at. And I'm really curious for your perspective as seasoned expert fundraisers. Then a lot of donors are going to ask, especially the savvy ones, what is the return on investment? And in the nonprofit space, ROI, I think the I also stands for impact. So how are you baking in the ROI equation in fundraising when you're consulting for these nonprofits? How does the impact measurement and kind of the ROI fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that question can be answered two ways. First is by articulating your goals in a way that says, here are the 5 projects and initiatives we are going to make investments in over the next 5 years. And this is what we plan on doing. And then updating people, donors on your progress is one way you measure impact. I mean, it's not true impact, but it at least is saying, I have a plan and I'm demonstrating to you that I can follow that plan and that I can execute on that plan. Because a lot of organizations will kind of, and Rashida referenced this, but will kind of follow the money versus sticking to their plan. And so they'll be over here trying to get money from another funder when in actuality, they should have been going to a different funder that aligned with their original plan. And then within the goals themselves, I mean, the nonprofit is really the one that sets the parameters around what the impact of that particular project or initiative should be. And so it's their responsibility to articulate on the front end what that impact will be. And then it's their responsibility in following up with the donors to say, here's what our impact has been. And if it's not what we initially intended, we're now pivoting. So there's justification for making a pivot. And it's totally okay, but you've actually done what you said you were going to do in the beginning.
Yeah, that's so great. And that's kind of the whole purpose of measurement, right? Impact measurement is to say, are we on track towards our goals? And if not, to have the data and the information to be able to make those pivots. So there is a lot that's involved in being a development officer, so much more than I thought. Where it's like, wait, you can't just have had a sales and marketing background and in the private sector and join a nonprofit and help them raise money. And it seems like that's kind of where a lot of people get their start in the space. It's like they kind of join an initiative, they believe in a mission, and then they figure it out. And I love that Ask a Fundraiser is working to become that Rosetta Stone of the language of fundraising for nonprofits and individuals interested in the development path. But can you get into describing the skills gap that you might see that exists for nonprofits and trying to find really qualified development officers at a price they can afford? Because I know it's not a cheap resource for a nonprofit to have. And Rashida, you said, capacity and resources is also like one of the biggest constraints that especially smaller nonprofits have. So maybe starting with just like your perception on the skills gap when it comes to fundraising professionals.
Yeah, and I also have a couple of more thoughts on the impact piece, but because that's also another very expensive and also underinvested piece of nonprofit work, if we're being honest. And a lot of times donors either they don't understand why there needs to be money for that particular, either investing in a tool or investing in a consulting firm or an entity, a research entity to help help with that. So I have so many thoughts on that, but in terms of skills gaps, I would say, as Anna mentioned, like a lot of us come to this work from a variety of different experiences and have learned over time and along the way. Many of us have had, we don't know what we don't know, to be frank. If you're starting with a small organization and you may be the only person who's doing development, like how do you know that you're supposed to have a case statement? How do you know that you're supposed to have a CRM? How do you know to find Match Nice? Like how do you know these things? Like where thankfully there's a lot more written on nonprofits, and I think podcasts like this are really great because it's an education for people who are in this space, who are just kind of like, okay, I'm here now. I really care about this mission and vision. And now I have to do what? I have to put together an acknowledgement, a thank you. I have to figure out like how to track these donations. Like it's a lot, right? It's quite a bit, like you said, that goes into being in the development industry. And so I think that, yeah, I think that it depends on how you come to the work. Like for me, I have a degree in international business, and I worked in sales for a bit before I started my career at the Department of Commerce. So I did sort of understand what a sales funnel and a sales process was, and understood like you have a pipeline, and like, you have materials, and you have a script and all of these things. Like, so I had a little bit of knowledge, but let's say you don't have that, and you're an activist, and you are thrust into this sort of nonprofit space because there really isn't a whole lot of other places. If you're really passionate about a cause, let's say climate change, and you're on the activism side, and like, what else are you going to do other than start a nonprofit in many instances, right? Like, where else do you hold that space for what you are trying, the change that you want to see in the world? So a lot of people fall into it, and you've got to do everything from putting together a CRM, putting together your case statement. You need to have really good writers and clear communication. You need to have, advice on where to put your button for donate here, like all of these things, all of these things. I hope I didn't go too general, but there's a lot that goes into it. So there can be a lot of gaps depending on how you come to the work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would just add that it's important to study your craft. There are places out there that have, opportunities to learn. So the Association of Fundraising Professionals has, international conferences, national conferences, regional conferences. They have, local groups of development professionals. So really get to know, what offerings AFP has, or CASE is another major international organization that works primarily with higher educational institutions and hospitals, major, big, fundraising shops. And they do, a plethora of different conferences and trainings. And if you can't afford those, look for opportunities to plug yourself into some local offerings. And then the other thing is, have a vested interest in your organization. Like, the number of development professionals that I have seen skip all staff meetings, I'm like, why would you skip an all staff meeting? You're being given information about your institution. Why would you not want to attend something like that? Take a vested interest in what you are doing. This is not like, just because there's not degree programs out there doesn't mean it's not a serious profession. And it requires a significant investment of time. And then finally, I would say, look for mentors. When I was in college athletics and I didn't know anything, yes, we had structure and strategy within our departments, but I would go to the conferences and I would seek those speakers out that I felt understood the content best. And I aligned myself with them. I didn't ask for necessarily a formal mentorship all the time. But if I had to lead a board meeting for the first time, or when I had to lead a board meeting for the first time, I went to those individuals that I trusted in the profession to review the content that I had put together and ask for advice and counsel on how to improve it. So I continuously, personally wanted to become the best I could be in the profession. So I just say that there are resources out there, and we also have a personal responsibility to seek them out.
I appreciate the empowerment message to everyone out there. It's clearly how you've risen to where you both are, and thank you for being that example, and also for scaling all of your knowledge through Ask a Fundraiser. I'm really grateful to see the work that you're doing, advancing the sector as a whole and providing these resources to under-resourced nonprofits, so especially those. You know, we've talked a little bit about the skills, like the language of fundraising. Some of the things are innate, right? Like I think one thing that's come and become clear to me is you have to be able to clearly tell the story of why you're doing what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and what you need to succeed. And there's I'm learning a lot through this. Like, for example, Rashida, you'll have to tell me, what is a case statement? I don't know what a case statement is. But what are like the innate skills that you think are required, or and the ones that like are really learned? So like maybe looking through your own lived experience, like when you came into the space and you said, wow, I'm really good at this, but then you realize, oh, I really need to up on, this particular skill. Just curious to know, like, what is it that makes a really well-rounded fundraiser?
So you have you have to take the profession seriously, and I think that because it is no joke when you're under that pressure, it is real. But you also have to balance and have self-care and be cautious not to burn out. And so I say that because I have burnt out before, and I think that is actually happening quite a bit in the profession right now. That that people are, there's such a dearth of folks in the profession at the moment. So you're seeing a lot of very senior folks retire over the last number of years. Things have changed since COVID. So you're connecting with a lot of donors and funders. Like now it's starting to change. Conferences are starting to come back, but a lot of this has been shifting and changing since 2020. And I think that it has been a tough time for folks in the development space, because there still is that need to raise and to meet goals. And so I agree with Anna 100% in terms of investment in yourself, because the industry, if you look at any of the job openings right now, it's a pretty good time to be in the development profession. It's a pretty good time. I mean, if you've seen any of those job announcements, it's a pretty good time. So, but you have to invest in yourself, right? You have to invest in yourself, and really want to develop the skill sets that that you may be a little bit weak on. I'll give you just one quick example. A number of years ago, I was responsible for some sort of, it wasn't a case statement, but it was like a proposal. And it was the first time I had done a proposal like by myself. And I was like the lead writer. So it was the first time. And I'm going to show you all my cards. Basically, my senior level development, I think it was a director at the time, was like, wow, we just assumed because of your background that your writing would be a little bit better. And I was like, ooh. I was like, ow. And what I did with that information was I went back and I was like, wow, I must have missed stuff. And I, reviewed the document and changed and fixed it. But I actually invested in writing classes for myself. I also, the last few times, reached out to a number of colleagues just to edit my work before I submitted it, just to see if I was missing things, and really tried to develop that skill set, because development is, writing is very critical in development. And it was a little bit of a knock, that like, I wasn't necessarily, my writing wasn't necessarily up to the standard of the position that I was in. But I was like, okay, cool, like no problem, I got it. And I'm going to invest in myself to make sure that my writing is like, really, really on par with everyone else and like excelling. So that's just an example of, like I said, some of the stuff that you have to take on your own to be able to fill the gaps.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I would say, one of the innate skills of being an effective and successful fundraiser is really having self-awareness and understanding how people are responding to you. So you have to be very perceptive in your interactions and relationships with other people, and particularly donors. You have to understand, like, when you're talking too much, or if you are not talking enough, or if you need to explain things more, or if you need to ask questions. So being self-aware is not something that everyone has. Or, there are very awkward people sometimes in the world, which is completely okay, but that may not be the best person for specific development roles. So understanding, if you want to be in development, which of the roles suit you best, because there are lots of different roles you can play from a development perspective. And really, but if you're working externally, and especially on the individual giving side and the major gift level, or leadership gift level, or plan giving level, you really have to be able to connect with people and understand when something is not going right, and self-correct as quickly as you possibly can.
I appreciate the vulnerability and the candidness of your responses. And really the root of the question was, your skills and experience can be intimidating for folks that are thinking about getting into the space. It's taken you years of hard work, and just, I can't even begin to imagine the effort that it's taken for you two, especially as women of color, to break into this space and to establish your own credibility and practices and everything that you're doing. So to create this little opening into just showing the importance of self-awareness, and that no one's perfect and we're always working on ourselves, is really insightful, and I appreciate that. We started this interview and I'd ask how you met, and you mentioned, well, there's not a lot of Black people in fundraising, especially Black women. So, and Rashida, I noticed that I saw this post where you said that Black philanthropy looks different. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I do tend to have like a little bit of a rant on my Twitter account, but it's okay. So over the last number of years, and Anna can jump in on this because I think has really been taking, she's even opened and expand my eyes to just how important Black philanthropy is. I've always known that it was important, but I had worked so long in the international development space that space tends to have a lot of residual colonial complexities, because a lot of a lot of like the global South, and like that relationship with the global North, and sort of like the flows of funds and all of that. A few years ago, I started another company called Dia Fund, and it was a crowdfunding platform that connected members of the diaspora in the United States to vetted nonprofits in their home countries. And the reason I started that was because I was so focused on working in the international development space. There were times where it was very awkward for me to be having conversations about like, poverty and like poverty mindset of, particular countries. And, I'm a Black woman. So you're like telling me about other Black people and like their mindset. It can be very hectic when you're going into that. And I know there's other nonprofit folks like Vu Lee that have, Nonprofit AF, that have discussed this whole sort of white supremacy culture that has been the foundation, frankly, of philanthropic funding, particularly in the global South. And I tend to want to push back against that, because as a Black community, whether you're looking at it from the United States or from the diaspora, or I was talking with a friend this morning about, supporting family members in different places in the Caribbean, Black people are very philanthropic and have a culture of giving that sometimes is not appreciated or understood in the larger kind of philanthropic discussions that are had about like a Mackenzie Scott or the Gates Foundation, and sort of millions of dollars that are then directed towards like these people's causes, right? And I just tend to have a very strong reaction when people do not, and other folks have done a lot of work on this. There's a Black Philanthropy Month that happens in August every year, that is part of the WISE Fund, which was started by Dr. Copeland. It's been a consistent thing to kind of minimize the contributions of Black philanthropy, and so I tend to have a very forceful response when I see mainstream entities that are constantly talking about like the large funds that are coming from the Mackenzie Scotts, or these sort of, just like traditional capitalistic systems that have created kind of the problems that we have today. So yeah, so that's what that was what that tweet was about, was like, yeah, I think I was specifically talking about a gentleman in New Orleans that had basically out of his own funds had put together like a gas giveaway recently. And he's like a local guy, I've met him. And I was like, this is Black philanthropy. Like this dude just decided to get up and spend $30,000 for people's gas. And it just looks different, and it's still philanthropy, and we're still continuing to support our communities. So that was the background on that.
Thanks, Rashida. Anna, anything come up for you on that topic that you wanted to share?
I mean, my philosophy is there is significant Black philanthropy out there. I think it's completely untapped right now from a traditional philanthropic perspective. And I believe that our organizations, like Black organizations, HBCUs, social justice organizations, arts organizations, political organizations that are operating with the highest integrity deserve additional investment, but they need to develop their plans so that they are able to ask for support at the highest levels. And Black philanthropists will step up to support these organizations. I still think that there's going to be a need to go outside the Black community as well, but I think that there's so many more resources that are available. And I'll just like leave this like kind of last, thoughts around Black philanthropy. When we were working at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we started fundraising for that project in about 2006. I joined in 2009 and we opened in 2016. When they started fundraising, or when we started fundraising for that project, there were no prospects, there were no donors. And in the period of about 10 years, we raised 134 gifts at $1 million plus. That was evenly split between individuals, corporations, and foundations. 42 individual donors, 80% which were Black, were $1 million donors, were $42 million donors were stepped up. 80% of those were Black. 112 donors gave between 100,000 and $1 million. 354 gave between 25,000 and 100,000. And then we had an ambassador program for the under 40 generation. 770 ambassadors gave between 5,000 and 25,000. And we had 200,000 members. And so there is an untapped pool of resources out there, but our organizations need to make sure that they are preparing themselves to tap into this, to this wealth and this money.
Well, Rashida, thank you for having the courage to bring that energy right back at this really difficult issue. And both of you, Anna, even just opening my eyes to just the power of Black philanthropy and just what, from my perspective, seems to be a largely unseen and unappreciated part of the sector that needs to be elevated. So thank you for bringing light to that. I know we are almost out of time. I was going to ask, what's your biggest advice, for nonprofits struggling with fundraising, but I think we've been answering that question throughout the entire podcast. So I'll put that one aside, and maybe, me and my team can debrief on that. But one final question for you both. Either can start. What is it that you want your lasting legacy to be?
Rashida, do you want to start? You want me to start? I'll start. Okay. So, I have always had a passion for the upliftment of the African-American community. It's one of the reasons why I went to Howard. It's one of the reasons why I pursued college athletics, because I wanted to see equity on the sports side of things. It's one of the reasons why I went to the Smithsonian and the National Museum of African-American History and Culture, and why now where I'm servicing mostly African-American led and serving organizations, not exclusively, but almost. And so a lasting legacy for me would be to create a centralized fund that would support Black organizations, longstanding Black organizations of 50 plus years at the highest levels, really understanding what these organizations actually need to be able to help transform the African-American community. And let's figure out how much that is actually going to cost. And then let's go out and raise the money. Is it a $20 billion initiative? Is it a $100 billion initiative? We need to know what makes up that number and how much that number is. And then we need to go out and start asking at the highest levels.
That's quite a big goal. I love it. And it seems to be just an extension of everything you're doing. So thank you for sharing that, Anna.
That's so funny, because that's also one of my so in terms of legacy, I have a very similar very similar thing. I've been toying around, and Anna knows this because we've talked so much about this. One of the first meetings that we have at a co-working space that's now closed, she'll remember that I was drawing this ecosystem, and I was like, okay, we can take your fund, and then we can connect with HBCUs, and then HBCUs can do research, and we've had all of these conversations about how how we can get this done. And both of us are very ambitious, and we're we can just raise the money, it's cool, what's $100 billion?
Oh, right.
And so very similar to Anna, I want to give back to the Black diaspora in general, sort of throughout the world, because a lot of my family comes from the Caribbean, but also just really also focused on the African-American experience here in the United States, because there used to be much more of a closer link in those things. When you look at the free Nelson Mandela, movement and all of that, a lot of African Americans have done so much for the Black diaspora around the world, and vice versa. And I think for me, I have seen some divisions over the last number of years in sort of that relationship. And it's really important for me to invest in that relationship and continue to promote of that Pan-African unity. So that's, for me, I hope at some place there will be something written about that and the continuation of that.
Well, if there are any two individuals who have the knowledge, skills, network, and power to make those things happen, I'm looking at them. I'm talking to them. And I feel so honored to have shared this space with you both. Thank you for all of the insights, the vulnerabilities, the knowledge, the experience that you've shared on this show. I think another part of your legacy that is coming to life through Ask a Fundraiser is also just the access and knowledge and growth in closing the skills gap of fundraising professionals all across the country and the world. So thank you for doing your part in elevating the sector as a whole and everything that you're doing to shine the light on Black philanthropy and moving that forward as well. It's been a pleasure having you both. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Welcome back to the Nonprofit Lab. Hey, Madeline. Hey, Ibrahim.
Hello.
Hey, Puya.
Hey. So what do you guys think of the conversation with Rashida and Anna?
I thought it was great. I loved hearing about both of their career paths and how they made it to where they are now. Once again, another unconventional career path, just kind of following. I mean, maybe the unconventional actually is conventional, and that's what we're learning on this podcast.
No, definitely echoing what Madeline said. I think it was definitely cool to see their perspective. They've been working in this industry and kind of guiding the path for a lot of nonprofits for quite some time. So it was really cool to see the approach they take and the mindset that goes behind like the guidance they give these nonprofits.
Yeah, totally. One of the things that stuck out to me from one of the first episodes that we did with Laura about nonprofit education being new, like the ability to go get a master's or even any other advanced degree or certificate in the nonprofit sector is relatively a new thing. But then Rashida and Anna focusing on how it's even a smaller focus when it comes to the types of resources and education there is for fundraisers. Yeah, there's different, organizations, associations around fundraising, but it's still this large skills and educations gap around fundraising in the sector as a whole.
Yeah, it was wild to hear that there's no real formal way to get training on how to raise money, because that's such a critical core part of nonprofit life. And, it just makes me sad because there's a lot of people that get into the nonprofit sector through whichever different channel, just trying to make a difference in the world, only to, kind of be winging it when it comes to fundraising, which is just crazy.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see there's no set setup or set steps to follow when it comes to running a nonprofit or how to approach fundraising or any of the things that are involved with the responsibilities of a nonprofit. During the conversation, I know that they mentioned the skill gap and how a lot of people come into the nonprofit sector with a variety of experiences. There's a very diverse background when it comes to different nonprofit leaders, and they've all learned different things on the way that helps them execute in terms of the planning. But there's no set of instructions that exist currently that put you in a position to lead a nonprofit to your fullest ability. It all comes from experiences you've had that allow you to make those decisions along the way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm certain that information is out there and it exists, and that there is a very procedural way of going about fundraising and a fundraising strategy, but it's not readily accessible. There's no Google for fundraisers in that sense, or there's definitely a big gap that exists there. And it's cool to see Rashida and Anna working to close that fundraising skills gap through their platform and everything that they're working on launching with Ask a Fundraiser.
I mean, I loved what they were saying about just because there aren't degree programs out there for this doesn't mean it's not a serious profession. That was also really surprising to hear the story that Anna was telling about some folks that would decide not to go to an all hands meeting or things like that, where, there's opportunities. It was an interesting juxtaposition or explanation of the status quo, that because there aren't resources out there necessarily to kind of hold your hand and take you through how to fundraise correctly, which is obviously what Ask a Fundraiser is doing, that some people aren't taking the initiative to study their craft, right? And take personal responsibility to excel in this field. And I can personally see, I can relate to that. I think that something that I learned after college and I'm still working on is, you go through school and you go through high school and you go through college, and it's kind of like, this is what you're supposed to do. You just do these things and you check these boxes, and then you are a real person or whatever. But once you get to your career and, what you choose to do as a profession, there are some options to do things like getting your master's degree or obviously continue schooling. But I think a big lesson that I've learned, and it sounds like, is something that professionals in the nonprofit space, especially, the best of the best are doing this, is taking your own education, taking it upon yourself to educate yourself and be the best that you can be. So it's exciting to hear that Ask a Fundraiser is kind of going to put some structure in place for people who might be like me, who are looking for the steps they need to take to get to that level.
Yeah, I think Anna also mentions the concept of like you kind of have to have a genuine vested interest in the work you do for it to kind of come into fruition and build out to what you want it to be. And like you said, Madeline, she had mentioned that there's not like set degree programs for a lot of the nonprofit work that people do like globally, but that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to learn. Like these all hands meetings or these learning opportunities when it comes to volunteer work or even certain curriculums that offer certifications or just some level of exposure to a learning experience that could help benefit you in terms of like a leadership role at a nonprofit or executing on what the nonprofit's goals are. Like at the end of the day, no one knows everything, and you kind of need continuous support in building like a strong foundation, and especially taking like a more modernized approach, because as we've seen in our research, like there's a significant portion of nonprofits that are still not necessarily dated, but are slow in terms of adopting modernized ways of running their nonprofits and scaling at the level they want to scale at.
Totally. The one kind of profession and experience I have that relates to this fundraising skills gap is software sales. There's, you can't go to college and get a degree in being a software salesman, but there's a ton of different resources around it. And the best salesmen or saleswomen are the ones who really understand the product and the company and what they're selling, and also believe in what they're selling and are looking to create this value proposition. And it's not just, look what this, widget can do. And this is, you put in this and it gets that. They don't just talk about the how or the what. They're also very focused and bought in on the mission of the organization and believe in what they're doing. So it's cool to see a similar parallel to nonprofit fundraising from my own experience in software sales.
Don't forget also knowing who the customer is and what their pain points are. I think you can, study what you're doing, obviously, but if you're not knowing how whatever you're selling is solving someone's problem, that's the other side of it. And I think that's knowing your market. And I've seen amazing salespeople that, when you're really tapped into who you're selling to, or who you're raising money from, or, the systems in place that you kind of need to work to reach your goals, that's when you can be really successful.
Yeah. The other analogy to software sales is the really long sales cycles that Anna and Rashida were explaining for going after major gifts or grants or, these bigger institutional types of, fundraising rounds that nonprofits can pursue. Is it's not this overnight solution. Like, you don't meet a donor, a major gifts donor, and then the next day they invest. It's the same with startup investing too, right? Like, never have I ever met someone and been like, hey, this is Match Dice, and they're like, oh, here's $1 million check. Like, that doesn't happen. There's a lot of time and cultivation and a lot of pre-work that has to happen to get to the point of even being able to ask a donor. And I like that they're creating the reality into the work that it takes to actually do fundraising correctly, and that you can't necessarily do everything.
I really draw a big parallel with marketing, with the discussion about foundational work and about time commitment. I think that when I think about marketing, there's so many different ways you can do marketing. You can be on TikTok. You can have a commercial in the Super Bowl. You can make cool t-shirts. You can be out in the street. You can do anything. There's any, possibility. That's where all the creative parts of marketing come in. But none of it matters if you haven't done the foundational work of figuring out what you just said, Booyah, what are we doing? What are we working on that we need to raise money for? And how are we, what is the best, who are the people that are going to give us that money? Because once you come up with, and that's, coming back to your foundation or your mission and everything like that. We've talked about this, I think, almost every episode, but if you're crystal clear on that, then it just makes it so easy to say, oh, well, obviously t-shirts make sense. Or versus like, the billboard idea, yeah, that's really cool, but nobody that it drives or whatever it is, it's really about, once you do the foundational work, the rest of it, and in terms of execution, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's an easier decision to make when you're focused on the mission.
The comparison you made, Puya, between like fundraising for nonprofits and fundraising for startups being very similar. This is just an observation that I've had, but the idea of it being complex or it being like a time consuming and like you have to fight for it process is kind of essential in a way. If you think about like there's only a set amount of money that can be put towards a set number of things. At the end of the day, these donors are the investor in the startup's eye, where you need to make a case, show where the money is being spent, show what the results are going to be. But the nonprofits is not necessarily an ROI, but it's an ROI, meaning impact, like return of impact. Where is the impact going? Where is my money being spent? And if the process was too simple or too straightforward, then we'd be having money being thrown all over the place or none at all, just because it'd be that simple of a process where now you don't know where the money is actually being allocated. I do think that it's definitely in a position, and this is where the conversation with Rashida and Anna come into play. It's like that process can be simplified in terms of the approach and preparing for it. So I don't know how many times we've iterated through our pitch for Match Nice. Like I'm sure a nonprofit needs to do something similar, especially in like a larger donor's eyes, to justify a larger donation amount to help them push through the next year or few years or however long that roadmap lasts for them.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Even what you just said about like the ROI, as a startup, you have to be able to show a formula or an equation where the work and the value that you're creating can create profit and that you can duplicate that over and over again. And for nonprofits, it's the equation is similar. But it's around impact and the potential. But especially comparing the pre-seed startup stage where you don't necessarily have revenue coming in and you don't necessarily have customers and your product's not developed yet, you're looking for the funding to get going. For those nonprofits that are grassroots and working to get going, what is shared is the belief factor. Like you have to be so convicted, and the conviction for what you're doing has to be so strong that the people are investing in you as the founder and what you're doing as much as they are in your vision and your company. And I think that that's so important for organizations that are creating the stewardship model of every person in that organization being a fundraiser needs to realize, right? Like it's not that you have this degree in nonprofit fundraising that makes you a great fundraiser. And a lot of times it's the ability to connect with people and to communicate what you're working on in like a compelling and sensible way, and to be able to make that donor or the investor feel like they're part of that vision is, I think, a part of the formula for success, but it's not everything.
I agree. And there's a interesting point that you made. So there's a difference between like pre-seed startups versus startups that have some level of funding or were able to build a product from the ground up with very little funding. That comes into play in the nonprofit industry as well, because different nonprofits require different levels of funding to accomplish their goals. You could be a nonprofit that, it only costs $10 to affect an individual in the community versus a nonprofit where the work they do is in the tens of thousands or even millions. That's when you kind of have to take a similar approach of like, how do we justify needing such a large donation for this amount of impact? And they more or less are competing with other nonprofits who can have a similar level of impact at a lower cost per person. So the mindset's still there. Like you have to find a way to pitch the case and make it understandable where, this $1 million donation to this nonprofit might impact 10,000 people in this community. but this nonprofit needs the same amount of money to build a bunch of houses in a low income community, like area of a state or a city. Then now when you look at the numbers, like, okay, this is technically impacting less people, but where's the long-term effect? And that's where you have to come like with the data, with the intention, with like the long-term vision of what the impact is going to be.
I think this also comes back to the conversation, the part of the conversation where you were talking about speaking about impact as progress. And also what I think, I don't remember if Rashida or Anna said it, they were talking about following the money versus sticking to the plan, right? And like being laser focused on whatever your mission is, even if it means that if your mission is to solve world hunger or do something that's really, really grand, obviously you're not going to solve that problem in maybe even a decade or like it's going to take a really, really long time. So I think as long as you're laser focused on your mission and communicating that impact as progress reports and saying, hey, we tried out this campaign. We thought that we were going to hit this, incremental goal towards our grander mission. It didn't work. And we're going to switch now. I think that conversation, like just talking about the impact over time makes it easier to then swallow for someone who's like, wait, I thought that I was giving, X amount of dollars towards this specific initiative, helping communicate that it's not actually really about the initiative necessarily. It's about the larger mission and, testing things out and seeing if those programs are working or not to achieve that larger mission.
There's so many jump off points from that interview that we could continue to explore. I think one of the aha moments that I had was just how complicated nonprofit fundraising is, and that it's not at this simple affair of just saying, here's how much we need to raise and let's do it. There's so many ways that you could do it, and every channel, whether it's raising money on your website or applying for a grant application or peer-to-peer fundraising, corporate sponsorships, every single one of those domains is a domain of expertise within itself that takes a lot of planning and pre-work. And being able to be the master of all of those things is a lifetime effort that not many people are going to get towards. But with the complexity factor of fundraising in mind, one of the things that Rashida and Anna said as well that stuck with me was the idea that it's not smart to go after everything, because it's like you try to do everything and you accomplish nothing kind of approach. So curious for your thoughts on that segment.
I mean, when she was talking about the idea of here's the 5 things that we're going to invest in, I think in my mind, what was echoing was, right, when you pick those 5 things, you're also not picking all the other things. And I think that's a good exercise always to kind of name the things that you're not going to focus on because you've chosen to focus on these other things, right? To say, we're going to go after this institutional funder, but we're not going to pursue this grant, or we're not going to pursue, running our gala this year. Just naming those things, I think, is a pretty powerful exercise.
Definitely. And I read an article recently, and it kind of aligns with this. It's if you have a ton of things to focus on, it's better to focus on them one by one, because at the end of the day, when you're going through milestones or like checkups and you're looking at the progress you've made, it's a lot better to be done with things than to tell yourself down the line, oh, I'm 50% done with everything, versus I have half the items checked off on my list. Like if you're able to work a little bit on everything, that's great. But if you're 6 months in and you haven't 100% completed any of your tasks, there's something wrong and your alignment isn't there.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's like a time management thing, right? We talk about time management a lot, but I think it's also like if you have too many things to focus on, if you have like 10 things to focus on and you can only 50% complete them, to your point, maybe just pick 3 and try to just get them all done. Because then you can look back and be like.
One other note that I had that I wanted to bring up was this notion of sustainable fundraising, where you may have a number of initiatives that you're fundraising for, that you need money. That money is going to translate into specific products or services for a community or whatever cause that you're working on. But then to not be so dependent on donations as the only source of revenue for your organization. And so the brilliant approach that Rashida and Anna suggested was, hey, maybe one of your fundraising initiatives should be towards something that could be revenue generating for your organization. So we may be donating to, $100,000 into this program, but this program is actually going to generate that $100,000 back over the course of the next 3 years, or whatever that math turns out to be. And I just love the idea of creating that ROI equation also in terms of your donation can translate into X amount of revenue for our organization through these services as well.
Yeah, the revenue stream idea is brilliant. I think that Tiffany was talking about it in the Fulfill episode, and I was like, yes, that's awesome, to have an additional revenue stream. Like, what a brilliant idea to just give yourself a break from the fundraising, and also to try to stop yourself from needing to be running completely on philanthropic dollars. It just makes sense. And just makes sense.
Yeah, we talked about this, I think it was in the last episode, about how nonprofits need to take the necessary steps to reduce their dependency on donors and grants. Because at the end of the day, you can't be in a position where it's the end of the month and you're begging for that check to cover rent or payroll or any of those things. Working on creating some kind of like consistent revenue stream, whether it be from donors or just some kind of approach that the nonprofit takes, that puts you in a position where you're less dependent on, these last minute donations or these time consuming efforts to get these larger checks. And like we've talked about this before, like a nonprofit at the end of the day is a business. It's just a business focused on impact versus a business on selling goods or services.
100% on that. What other things popped up for you guys? Any other notes that you had from this episode that you wanted to bring up?
I think that just going back to the foundational work conversation, which is what Ask a Fundraiser is looking to accomplish, right? Helping nonprofits more effectively understand their own goals and speak about their fundraising goals in a way that makes sense to donors on different channels. I think that something that Rashida talked about was there's all the foundational work, right? Then there's also the amount of time that it takes to do that foundational work, which I think in my work, just doing operations and marketing consulting and just having worked in events and things like that, a lot of times people don't want to do that foundational work. It feels like a waste of time. It's also something where, especially if you're paying someone like a consulting service, you might say, okay, we had you on for this engagement, like, where's my return or where's my results? Like, why aren't we raising more money right now? And I think it's so important to communicate. And I know that Rashida and Anna do a great job of this, just communicating how much time it's really going to take to do this deep thinking work. And it's something that I say all the time in my own career, which is move slow to move fast, right? Do all this foundational work so that at the end of the day, when it's time to actually set up those programs, you don't have any questions about what are we doing? What are our goals? You're laser focused, you already know, and it's just a matter of execution. And that's the last part of the puzzle that Rashida was talking about, that once you actually do all the foundational work, you actually have to do it. You have to go and do the plan that you came up with. And so I just want to acknowledge and recognize that all of that is a lot of work. The planning and then plus the actual execution is huge, and it's time consuming, but it's so well worth it.
Made me want to take a deep breath when you like we're like, okay, great, you did all of that planning, now it's time to do it.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, it's only a part of the equation, which fundraising is a lot of hard work. And I think one of the challenges and the questions that we should be asking ourselves as a company as we're moving forward with product development and design is, how can we integrate that kind of holistic strategic thinking around fundraising as part of the online fundraising process, right? Like, how can what nonprofits build on MatchNice be extensible to these other fundraising channels and reflect this core strategy. And if nonprofits don't have that core strategy well defined yet, and they don't know the exact numbers, how do we support that path of definition and clarity in a meaningful way?
Definitely. And I also want to recognize what a huge learning for me from this conversation was also about Black philanthropy. It's something that I've never heard the phrase before. And I was just very interested to hear Rashida and Anna's perspective on the fact that it just does not get as much coverage as, things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Melinda Gates or Bezos or any of these larger, white philanthropy stories that you hear about in the news. So that was just something that was really eye-opening for me. And for me, it's one of those things where representation matters, right? Now that I have learned about Black philanthropy, I am aware of it and able to seek it out and lift it up and recognize it when I see it. So I just want to recognize that as a learning that I took away from this one.
I love that you brought that up and that you're echoing that. I mean, for me, it was learning as well. The fact that just challenging our own biases and our own conceptions of close your eyes and imagine a philanthropist. What do you see? It's like, wait, what did everyone just think of? And how do we expand our mindset and our perception around the philanthropic market and be more inclusive and more empowering, especially of Black nonprofit leaders and organizations and philanthropists out there. It's been another real one. Madeline, Ibrahim, thanks for tuning in and for joining on another episode of the Nonprofit Lab. It's always great to have y'all.
Thanks for having us, Puya.
Yeah, thanks, Puya.
Cheers. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Nonprofit Lab. We hope you learned something new from our conversation with Rashida and Anna. As always, I will end our show with a quote, this one from Frederick Douglass, who said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Shout out to everyone out there working hard to advance the nonprofit sector, Rashida and Anna, for the amazing work that they're doing in the effort to close the fundraising skills gap. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe and follow us on our socials at Match Nice. Would love to connect with you all. Feel free to send us some DMs, some messages. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you on the next episode.